This is what happens when you people try to act like you belong here, Officer Todd Flemming announced loudly, his gun trained on Calvin Mercer, who knelt with his hands behind his head on the sun-drenched sidewalk outside the federal building. The lunch hour crowd gathered, some recording as Flemming continued his performance, completely oblivious to the irony of his location. Running drugs in broad daylight, probably got a whole crew around here. Flemming called out to his approaching backup units. Calvin remained perfectly still, his FBI identification burning like a secret weapon in his jacket pocket, knowing that Flemming had just committed career suicide in front of multiple witnesses and cameras while targeting a federal agent conducting official business. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. The October sun blazed overhead, casting sharp shadows across the marble steps of the federal building as downtown office workers emerged for their lunch break. Calvin Mercer had been standing near the building's main entrance in his green hoodie and dark jeans, appearing to anyone watching like just another citizen going about his day. What they couldn't see was the sophisticated surveillance equipment in his backpack or the federal badge that identified him as Special Agent Calvin Mercer, FBI, conducting authorized surveillance on a suspected white-collar crime ring operating from the financial district. Officer Todd Flemming had spotted Calvin from his patrol car 3 blocks away, his prejudiced instincts immediately triggered by the sight of a black man in casual clothes near what he considered his territory. Without running plates, calling for backup, or following any proper protocol, Flemming had accelerated toward the scene, his mind already constructing a narrative based purely on racial bias. Now Calvin knelt on the concrete, feeling the heat radiating up from the pavement, while Flemming strutted behind him like a peacock, displaying for the growing crowd. The officer's short-sleeved uniform was crisp and pressed, his badge gleaming in the sunlight as he gestured dramatically with his free hand while keeping his service weapon pointed at Calvin's back. "Look at this piece of work," Flemming announced to a businessman in a suit who had stopped to watch the spectacle. "Thought he could just set up shop right here in front of the federal building like we wouldn't notice. These dealers think they're untouchable, but I've been watching this one for weeks." Calvin's jaw tightened at the outright lie, but he remained silent, his training keeping him calm even as rage built in his chest. Weeks of watching meant Flemming had been racially profiling random black men in the area, probably harassing multiple innocent citizens while actual criminals operated freely elsewhere. Cell phones appeared throughout the gathering crowd as office workers on their lunch break began recording the scene. A young woman in a red dress held her phone high, capturing Flemming's theatrical performance while whispering commentary to her friend. An elderly man in a blue jacket shook his head in disgust but continued watching, his expression growing more disapproving by the minute. "You got anything sharp on you, boy?" Flemming demanded, emphasizing the racial slur with particular venom. "Any needles, weapons, drugs in those pockets?" Calvin felt the officer's boot nudge against his leg, a deliberate humiliation tactic designed to dehumanize him in front of the audience. "Sir, I need you to identify yourself and state your probable cause for this detention," Calvin said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command despite his current position on the ground. The formal language and composed tone seemed to irritate Flemming, who interpreted Calvin's education and articulation as disrespect. "Oh, we got a smart one here," Flemming laughed, playing to his audience. "Probable cause? How about loitering with intent to distribute? How about fitting the description of a known dealer? How about being where you don't belong, doing what you got no business doing?" Each accusation was another nail in Flemming's professional coffin, though the officer was too intoxicated by his own performance to realize it. Calvin could hear the approaching sirens of backup units responding to Flemming's earlier call, which meant more officers would soon witness whatever happened next. The crowd continued growing as word spread through the lunch hour foot traffic. Someone had apparently live-streamed the incident because Calvin could hear murmurs about social media and shares. The federal building security cameras were undoubtedly recording everything, along with the body cameras that every officer in the district was required to wear during interactions. "Empty your pockets, slow and easy," Flemming commanded, his voice carrying the swagger of someone who believed he held absolute power in this moment. Calvin began reaching toward his jacket pocket, moving deliberately slowly to avoid any appearance of sudden movement that Flemming might use to justify escalation. Detective Maria Santos arrived as the second patrol car pulled up to the scene, her experienced eye immediately taking in the situation with growing concern. She had worked with Flemming before and knew his tendency toward racial profiling, but she had never seen him quite this bold or public about it. The federal building location and the size of the crowd made this incident exponentially more dangerous for everyone involved. Santos approached cautiously, noting the professional way Calvin was handling himself despite being held at gunpoint. Something about his composure and the formal language he had used earlier suggested this might not be the typical street encounter Flemming was describing over the radio. "Flemming, what's the situation here?" Santos asked, though she kept her voice low, not wanting to undermine her fellow officer in public, while still trying to assess whether he had made a serious error in judgment. "Caught this dealer setting up right in front of the federal building," Flemming replied, his chest puffed with pride. Bold as brass, like he owned the place, probably figured the location would keep him safe from search and seizure. Calvin's hand moved slowly toward his inner jacket pocket, where his federal identification waited to transform this humiliating public spectacle into Flemming's worst nightmare. The irony was so perfect, it almost seemed scripted. A racist officer arresting an FBI agent for the crime of being black in public, doing it on federal property, in front of multiple cameras, during the lunch hour when maximum witnesses would be present. Santos watched Calvin's measured movements and professional demeanor, her instincts screaming that something was very wrong with Flemming's narrative. In her 15 years on the force, she had learned to read people, and nothing about this man suggested street dealer. His posture, his vocabulary, even the way he had positioned himself on the ground showed training and discipline that came from law enforcement or military background. The crowd pressed closer as more backup units arrived, their sirens drawing additional attention from the surrounding office buildings. Calvin could see office workers gathering at windows above, creating an amphitheater effect, with dozens of potential witnesses looking down at the scene. "What you reaching for there?" Flemming barked as Calvin's hand approached his jacket. "Don't you try anything stupid with all these people watching. That just makes you more dangerous, not less." "I'm retrieving my identification as you requested," Calvin responded calmly, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent crowd. Everyone was watching, sensing that this moment balanced on a knife's edge that could cut either direction. Calvin's fingers closed around the leather holder containing his federal badge and identification card. In this small rectangle of metal and paper lay the power to transform this racist theater into a career-ending catastrophe for Officer Todd Flemming. Every word Flemming had spoken, every assumption he had made, every slur and threat would now be seen in the harsh light of a federal civil rights violation captured on multiple cameras. Santos stepped closer, her hand instinctively moving toward her radio as her gut told her to start damage control procedures immediately. She could see Calvin's hand emerging from his jacket with what looked like an official credential holder, and her heart began racing as she realized what might be about to happen. The crowd held its collective breath as Calvin slowly withdrew his hand, the FBI badge and identification card gleaming in the afternoon sunlight like a sword being drawn from its sheath. Flemming's eyes focused on the credential holder, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing while his mouth continued running on autopilot. "What kind of fake ID scam is this supposed to be?" Flemming sneered, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "You dealers are getting creative, I'll give you that. Probably bought that off the internet." Calvin opened the leather holder with deliberate precision, revealing the golden FBI shield and his official identification card with its federal seal and photograph. The badge caught the sunlight and reflected it back into Flemming's face like a spotlight of justice, about to expose every racist assumption he had made. "Special Agent Calvin Mercer, Federal Bureau of Investigation," Calvin announced clearly, his voice carrying across the silent crowd with the authority of federal law enforcement. "You are interfering with an ongoing federal investigation, Officer Flemming." The words hit the scene like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through every person present. Flemming's face went white as paper, his gun hand beginning to tremble as the full magnitude of his error crashed down on him like an avalanche of consequences. Detective Santos closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, knowing that her department was about to face a federal incident that would make national headlines. The crowd erupted in gasps and murmurs as cell phone cameras zoomed in on the FBI badge, capturing the moment when racial profiling met federal authority and lost spectacularly. Calvin remained kneeling, letting the weight of his revelation settle over the scene like dust after an explosion, knowing that everything Flemming had said and done in the past 10 minutes would now be scrutinized by federal prosecutors and civil rights investigators. This was no longer a simple case of police misconduct. This had become a federal civil rights violation, captured on multiple cameras, witnessed by dozens of people, and about to go viral on social media. Officer Todd Flemming had just pointed a gun at a federal agent and accused him of being a drug dealer based purely on racial prejudice, and every second of it was recorded for posterity. The silence that followed Calvin Mercer's badge revelation stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Detective Maria Santos stood frozen, her hand still hovering near her weapon, watching as the color drained from Officer Todd Flemming's face. The federal identification gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its gold eagle and bold letters spelling out a reality that nobody on this sidewalk had anticipated. "Jesus Christ. Flemming, what have you done?" Santos whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the growing crowd. Flemming's service weapon remained drawn but now trembled in his grip. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, no words emerging as his brain struggled to process the catastrophic shift in circumstances. The confident swagger he'd displayed moments earlier evaporated, replaced by the dawning horror of a man who'd just stepped off a cliff in broad daylight. Calvin Mercer slowly rose to his feet, brushing dust from his dark jeans with deliberate calm. His movements were measured, professional, carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. When he spoke, his voice cut through the chaos with razor-sharp precision. "Officer Flemming, I'm going to need you to holster your weapon immediately. You've just compromised a federal surveillance operation that's been 3 months in development." Calvin's dark eyes locked onto Flemming's pale face. "I was conducting authorized federal business when your reckless intervention potentially blew an investigation targeting organized crime activities in this district." The words hit Flemming like physical blows. His weapon hand shook more violently as the implications crashed over him in waves. Federal agent, surveillance operation, compromised investigation. Each phrase drove another nail into the coffin of his career. Detective Santos stepped forward, her training finally overriding her shock. "Todd, weapon down, now." Her voice carried the sharp edge of authority, but underneath lay a tremor of barely controlled panic. She'd been a cop for 12 years, long enough to recognize a career-ending disaster when she saw one. Flemming's gun finally lowered, though his finger remained dangerously close to the trigger. "I didn't know," he stammered, his voice cracking like an adolescent's. "How was I supposed to know?" He looked like every other drug dealer I've busted in this neighborhood. The racist assumption hung in the air like toxic smoke. Several witnesses shifted uncomfortably, their phone cameras still recording every word, every expression, every damning second of what would soon become a viral catastrophe. Calvin Mercer's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Every other drug dealer, Officer Flemming? And what exactly does a drug dealer look like in your professional opinion? Before Flemming could dig his grave any deeper, the distinctive sound of multiple vehicles approaching at high speed cut through the tension. 3 black SUVs with federal plates pulled up to the curb, their occupants emerging with the crisp efficiency of a well-oiled machine. The woman who stepped out of the lead vehicle commanded immediate attention. FBI Supervisor Rachel Kim moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to cleaning up messes and demanding answers. Her red blazer contrasted sharply with her blue jacket, the professional ensemble lending weight to her already formidable presence. At 45, she'd navigated the federal bureaucracy long enough to know that this scene represented either a minor inconvenience or a major incident, depending on how quickly damage control could be implemented. "Agent Mercer," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Status report." Calvin straightened to his full height. "Supervisor Kim, I was maintaining visual contact with our primary target when Officer Flemming initiated an unlawful stop based on racial profiling. The suspect likely observed the commotion and has since disappeared. Our surveillance position is blown." Rachel Kim's expression darkened as she surveyed the scene. The crowd of witnesses, the multiple phone cameras, the obvious distress of the local officers, and her agent standing in the middle of it all, painted a picture she'd hoped never to encounter. Her gaze settled on Flemming, who seemed to shrink under the weight of federal scrutiny. "Agent Mercer has been working undercover surveillance for the past 6 weeks, Kim announced, her voice pitched to carry to the gathered crowd. "He's a 12-year veteran of the Bureau with commendations for valor and distinguished service. What I'm trying to understand is how a decorated federal agent conducting authorized operations ended up at gunpoint on a public sidewalk." The question wasn't really directed at Flemming, but his mouth moved anyway, producing a series of stuttered half-explanations that only made his situation worse. "I was just doing my job. I saw suspicious activity. How was I supposed to know he was federal?" "Perhaps by conducting proper identification procedures instead of assuming guilt based on appearance," Kim replied coldly. Her attention shifted to Detective Santos. "I assume body cameras were active during this incident?" Santos nodded reluctantly. "All interaction should be recorded, ma'am." "Excellent. Agent Martinez, secure that footage immediately. This is now evidence in a federal incident investigation." A younger agent moved swiftly to coordinate with Santos, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the sidewalk. She'd been Flemming's backup, which meant her own conduct would face scrutiny in whatever investigation followed. Captain James Morrison's arrival added another layer of institutional panic to the unfolding disaster. The precinct commander had received the call about a federal agent being held at gunpoint and had broken multiple traffic laws getting to the scene. What he found exceeded his worst fears. Morrison was a political animal who'd climbed the departmental ladder through careful navigation of municipal politics and media relations. One look at the scene told him that his department now faced the kind of federal scrutiny that could end careers and trigger consent decrees. The optics were devastating enough, but if this incident reflected broader patterns of misconduct, the Department of Justice would descend like wolves on wounded prey. "Supervisor Kim," Morrison said, approaching with the careful deference of someone trying to limit collateral damage. "Captain James Morrison, District 7. I want to assure you that this department takes any allegations of misconduct seriously. We're prepared to cooperate fully with any federal investigation." Kim's smile contained no warmth whatsoever. "Captain Morrison, I appreciate your cooperation. Agent Mercer will be providing a detailed incident report, and I trust your department's body camera footage will corroborate his account completely." The implicit threat landed like a sledgehammer. Morrison glanced at Flemming, who stood pale and trembling in the afternoon sun, then back at the federal supervisor, whose expression promised serious consequences for anyone who'd crossed her agent. Calvin Mercer watched the institutional machinery beginning to grind into motion around him. He'd known the moment he revealed his badge that this incident would spiral far beyond a simple case of mistaken identity. The cell phone videos, the body camera footage, and the presence of multiple witnesses guaranteed that Officer Todd Flemming's racist assumptions would face public scrutiny. But this wasn't about personal vindication for Calvin. His undercover work had been tracking a sophisticated money laundering operation with connections to several high-profile criminal organizations. 3 months of careful surveillance, building trust, gathering intelligence, all potentially compromised because a bigoted cop couldn't conceive of a black man having legitimate business in this neighborhood. The target was a financial facilitator named Marcus Webb. Calvin explained to Supervisor Kim in low tones. He was meeting contacts in the building behind us. When Flemming started his performance, Webb's security spotted the commotion, and they scattered. "We'll need to rebuild the entire surveillance profile from scratch." Kim's expression grew even more grim. The Webb investigation represented months of federal resources and interagency cooperation. If Flemming's prejudice had compromised a major organized crime investigation, the legal ramifications would extend far beyond simple civil rights violations. Detective Santos found herself caught between loyalty to her partner and recognition that this situation demanded absolute honesty. She'd worked with Flemming for 8 months and had witnessed his tendency toward aggressive stops in minority neighborhoods. She'd told herself it was just thorough police work, but watching him hold a federal agent at gunpoint while spouting racial assumptions forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her own complicity through silence. Officer Todd Flemming stood isolated in the middle of the chaos he'd created, watching his career implode in real time. The confident authority he'd wielded minutes earlier had transformed into trembling uncertainty as federal agents secured evidence and his own captain looked at him like a toxic liability. The crowd of witnesses continued recording, their phones capturing every moment of what would soon become a case study in police misconduct and institutional accountability. Calvin Mercer's calm professionalism contrasted sharply with Flemming's obvious distress, creating a visual narrative that would resonate far beyond this sidewalk. As federal agents coordinated with local officials to secure the scene and preserve evidence, the foundations were being laid for an investigation that would examine not just this single incident, but the broader patterns of behavior that had made it possible. Officer Todd Flemming had awakened a federal beast that would not rest until justice was thoroughly served. The afternoon sun continued shining down on a scene that would soon change multiple lives forever, marking the beginning of a reckoning that no one present could yet fully comprehend. The first video went live at 2:47 p.m., just 43 minutes after Calvin Mercer had shown his federal badge to a stunned Officer Todd Flemming. Marcus Rodriguez, a college student who had been eating lunch on the federal building steps, had captured the entire confrontation on his phone. His hands had trembled as he filmed, but the footage was crystal clear. Flemming's sneering face as he forced Calvin to his knees, the racist assumptions spilling from his mouth, and that electrifying moment when Calvin revealed his FBI credentials. Within minutes, the video had dozens of shares. Within an hour, thousands. The hashtag began trending almost immediately, Black FBI Agent. Then came the flood. 3 more videos surfaced from different angles, each capturing additional details that painted an even more damning picture of Flemming's behavior. One showed him aggressively waving his weapon while shouting about drug dealers. Another caught his face when Calvin revealed the badge, the color draining from his features like water from a broken dam. At Channel 7 News, investigative reporter Jennifer Walsh was wrapping up a mundane city council story when her phone exploded with notifications. Her news director burst into the editing bay, tablet in hand, face flushed with excitement. "Walsh, drop everything. We've got a federal agent racially profiled at gunpoint by city police. Videos are everywhere. This is going national." Jennifer grabbed her red blazer from the back of her chair, her mind already racing through the angles. She'd covered police misconduct before, but this felt different. A federal agent meant federal consequences. This wasn't going to disappear into the typical bureaucratic shuffle. By 4 p.m., Jennifer stood outside the federal building where the incident had occurred, her camera operator capturing the spot where Calvin Mercer had been forced to kneel just hours earlier. The lunch crowd had been replaced by curious onlookers and protesters who had materialized with stunning speed, drawn by the viral videos and the promise of justice. "This is where it happened," Jennifer began her report, gesturing to the sidewalk behind her, where FBI Special Agent Calvin Mercer was held at gunpoint by Officer Todd Flemming in what witnesses describe as an unprovoked act of racial profiling. The videos speak for themselves, but the stories from witnesses paint an even more disturbing picture. She turned to Marcus Rodriguez, who had agreed to an on-camera interview. The young man's dark hair was disheveled, his green t-shirt wrinkled from the stress of suddenly becoming a key witness in a federal incident. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The officer just assumed this well-dressed black man was a criminal. No investigation, no questions, just immediate aggression and a drawn weapon. When Agent Mercer showed that badge, you could see the officer's world collapse in real time. 3 blocks away, at the downtown police station, the phones had been ringing non-stop since 3 p.m. Captain James Morrison sat in his office, watching his department's reputation disintegrate in real time across multiple social media platforms. His orange polo shirt was soaked with sweat despite the air conditioning, and his hands shook slightly as he scrolled through the comments flooding the department's Facebook page. "Racist cops," read one comment with 47 likes. "How many other innocent people has Flemming terrorized?" read another. The questions kept coming, each one a dagger aimed at the heart of his command. Morrison's secretary knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "Sir, the mayor's office called. 3rd time in 20 minutes. They want answers. Now." On the 4th floor of the same building, Internal Affairs investigator Linda Hayes was experiencing a mixture of vindication and dread. A middle-aged black woman with 22 years in the department, she had been tracking complaints about Officer Flemming for months, watching a pattern emerge that her supervisors had consistently dismissed or minimized. Now, wearing her orange blouse and blue jacket, she sat surrounded by files that told a story she'd been trying to get someone to listen to for far too long. Flemming's personnel file read like a roadmap of racial bias. 17 complaints in 3 years. Excessive force allegations, community complaints about targeted harassment in predominantly black neighborhoods. Each incident had been investigated with the kind of thoroughness typically reserved for checking the weather, conclusions predetermined, sanctions minimal or non-existent. Hayes opened her laptop and began typing her preliminary report, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who had been waiting for this moment. This wasn't just about one incident on a sidewalk. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been enabled by a system more interested in protecting officers than protecting citizens. Her phone buzzed with a text from Calvin Mercer's FBI supervisor. "Federal investigation proceeding. Need all relevant files on Flemming within 24 hours. For the first time in months, Linda Hayes smiled. Across town, Calvin Mercer sat in the downtown office of civil rights attorney David Thompson, still wearing the green hoodie and jeans that had nearly cost him his dignity and possibly his life just hours earlier. Thompson, a distinguished black man in his 50s wearing a crisp orange shirt beneath his blue suit jacket, had been recommended by Calvin's FBI supervisor and had cleared his afternoon the moment he'd seen the videos. Agent Mercer, I want to be clear about what we're dealing with here, Thompson said, leaning forward across his mahogany desk. This isn't just a case of police misconduct. This is a federal civil rights violation captured on multiple cameras with dozens of witnesses. Officer Flemming didn't just profile you. He did it loudly, publicly, and with the kind of racist language that makes prosecutors salivate. Calvin nodded, his composure intact despite the emotional toll of the day. I understand the legal implications, Mr. Thompson, but I want to make sure this leads to real change, not just individual punishment. If Flemming was this comfortable acting this way in broad daylight, what's he doing when no one's watching? Thompson pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making notes. We're going to request every body cam video from Flemming's career, every complaint, every incident report. We're going to build a case that shows this wasn't an aberration, it was standard operating procedure. Meanwhile, Officer Todd Flemming sat in his patrol car in an empty parking lot, staring at his phone in horror. The videos had found him. His neighbors were tagging him. His children's friends were sharing clips of their father holding a federal agent at gunpoint while spouting racist assumptions. The comments were brutal, personal, and growing more numerous by the minute. His radio crackled to life. Unit 47, return to station immediately. Report to Captain Morrison's office. Flemming knew his career was over. The question now was whether he'd face just departmental discipline or federal charges. As he started his patrol car, his phone buzzed with a text from his wife. The kids saw the videos at school. Come home, we need to talk. Back at Channel 7, Jennifer Walsh was preparing for the evening broadcast, her investigation expanding by the hour. She had tracked down 4 additional witnesses, obtained copies of previous complaints against Flemming, and secured an interview with a former officer who had quit the department after witnessing what he called a culture of racial bias that extended from the streets to the supervisor's offices. At 6 p.m., Jennifer's report led the evening news. Tonight, a federal agent's humiliation becomes a community's vindication as videos of police racial profiling spark federal investigation and community outrage. The story was picked up by national networks within hours. Cable news programs began featuring the videos, legal experts weighed in on the implications, and social media campaigns calling for accountability gained momentum. What had started as one officer's racist assumptions had become a national conversation about police conduct and federal oversight. In his federal building office, Calvin Mercer's supervisor, Rachel Kim, watched the coverage while fielding calls from Washington. The FBI's Public Affairs Office wanted Calvin available for interviews. The Department of Justice was expediting their review of potential charges. This case was going to be fast-tracked through every level of the federal system. As night fell over the city, the videos continued to spread. The story continued to grow. And in police stations, federal buildings, and community centers across the country, people began asking the same questions. How many other Calvin Mercers had been humiliated without cameras present? How many other Officer Flemmings were protected by institutional silence? The viral videos had done more than expose one racist cop. They had torn open a conversation about justice, accountability, and the power of technology to finally hold the powerful accountable to the powerless. For Calvin Mercer, the humiliation was transforming into vindication. For Officer Todd Flemming, the reckoning was just beginning. The digital revolution of accountability had arrived, and there would be no going back. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Internal Affairs Office as Linda Hayes spread Officer Todd Flemming's personnel file across her oak desk. At 52, she had investigated hundreds of cases, but the body cam footage from Calvin Mercer's arrest still made her jaw clench with anger. The middle-aged black woman adjusted her orange blouse and smoothed her blue jacket, preparing for what she knew would be the most important investigation of her career. Linda pulled up the first complaint on her computer screen, dated 3 years earlier. Marcus Williams, 24. pulled over for supposedly matching the description of a robbery suspect. The description was vague at best, but Flemming had detained Williams for 2 hours, searching his vehicle without probable cause. The complaint had been marked as unfounded after a cursory investigation. The second file made Linda's stomach turn. Sarah Mitchell, a black nurse driving home from her night shift, stopped by Flemming under the pretense of a broken taillight. The body cam footage showed Flemming's aggressive tone as he questioned where she was going at 3 in the morning, his voice dripping with suspicion despite her hospital identification badge clearly visible on her green scrubs. Each file painted the same picture. Flemming consistently targeted black citizens with traffic stops that escalated beyond reasonable procedure. The pattern was unmistakable once Linda arranged the incidents chronologically. 17 complaints over 4 years, all involving black citizens, all dismissed or minimized by previous investigators who had clearly chosen to look the other way. Linda's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Maria Santos requesting a meeting. Within minutes, Maria knocked on the door, her usually confident demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. She wore a crisp white shirt under her department jacket, but her hands trembled slightly as she sat across from Linda. "I should have said something years ago," Maria began, her voice barely above a whisper. "We all saw how Todd behaved during traffic stops in our sector. The way he talked about black suspects, the jokes he made in the locker room, the way he seemed to find excuses to pull over certain drivers." Linda leaned forward, activating her digital recorder. "Tell me about specific incidents you witnessed." Maria took a deep breath, her conscience finally overriding years of institutional pressure to remain silent. "Last summer, Todd pulled over a black teenager for allegedly rolling through a stop sign. I was riding with him that day. The kid was terrified, kept his hands visible, answered every question respectfully. But Todd kept escalating, claiming he smelled marijuana, demanding to search the vehicle. I knew it was wrong, but I told myself it wasn't my place to intervene." The confession opened floodgates. Maria described incident after incident where Flemming had crossed lines she now recognized as clear patterns of racial bias. She explained how the department's culture of loyalty had silenced officers who might have spoken up, creating an environment where discrimination could flourish unchecked. "When I saw Agent Mercer on his knees with Todd's gun pointed at him," Maria continued, her voice breaking, "I realized how close we came to tragedy. That could have been my nephew, my brother, any black man who happened to be in the wrong place when Todd's prejudices took over." Linda documented every detail while her anger at the systemic failures grew stronger. The department hadn't just failed to stop Flemming, they had actively enabled him by dismissing complaints and transferring complaining citizens to dead-end bureaucratic processes. Across town in the federal building, Calvin Mercer sat in FBI Supervisor Rachel Kim's office, reviewing similar case files from incidents nationwide. Rachel wore her signature red blazer over a blue blouse, her professional appearance commanding respect as she coordinated with federal prosecutor Amanda Foster via video conference. "Agent Mercer's incident isn't isolated," Rachel explained to Amanda, whose red suit projected authority even through the screen. "Our Civil Rights Division has documented hundreds of similar cases where local officers have racially profiled federal agents, military personnel, and civilians. This case provides us with exceptional evidence due to the multiple camera angles and witness testimony." Calvin reviewed files from Detroit, Atlanta, Phoenix, and Miami, each containing disturbing parallels to his own experience. Black federal agents detained at gunpoint, black military officers humiliated during routine traffic stops, black professionals treated as criminals despite having no prior contact with law enforcement. "The pattern extends beyond individual officers," Calvin observed, his analytical mind processing the broader implications. "These incidents reveal systemic training failures and cultural problems within law enforcement that require federal intervention." Amanda nodded from the screen. We're building a comprehensive civil rights case that addresses both Officer Flemming's specific actions and the institutional failures that allowed his behavior to continue unchecked. Your testimony will anchor the case, but we need to demonstrate how this reflects broader constitutional violations. Rachel pulled up another file, this one containing body cam footage from Flemming's partner during a traffic stop 6 months earlier. The video showed Flemming approaching a black family's vehicle with his hand resting on his weapon, immediately demanding identification from all passengers, including children under 10 years old. His tone was hostile from the first moment, treating a minor traffic violation as a high-risk encounter. This footage was buried in the department's digital archives, Rachel explained. Linda Hayes found it during her investigation. It shows Flemming's pattern of treating routine encounters with black citizens as inherently dangerous situations requiring aggressive tactics. Calvin watched the footage with professional detachment, but his colleagues could see the personal impact in his tightened jaw. Agent Patricia Williams, a black woman who had worked with Calvin for 5 years, entered the office carrying additional files. "I've been reviewing cases from our joint task forces," Patricia said, wearing a green blouse under her department jacket. "Last year, Officer Flemming interfered with one of our surveillance operations in his sector. He detained our undercover agent for 45 minutes despite being shown federal identification. We filed a complaint, but it disappeared into their internal affairs system." The revelation added another layer to Flemming's pattern of misconduct. He had not only racially profiled civilians, but had actively interfered with federal law enforcement operations, potentially compromising national security investigations. Agent Marcus Thompson joined the group, his orange shirt visible under his open jacket as he shared his own experiences. "2 years ago, I was off duty, taking my son to basketball practice when Flemming pulled me over. Even after showing my federal badge, he insisted on running my plates and questioning why I was in that neighborhood. My 10-year-old son watched his father get treated like a criminal, despite being a federal agent." The personal stories created a powerful narrative of systematic discrimination that went far beyond Calvin's individual experience. The FBI agents recognized how their colleagues' public humiliation represented broader injustices they had all faced in various forms throughout their careers. Rachel coordinated with Amanda Foster to ensure every piece of evidence would be properly documented for the federal case. The prosecutor's expertise in civil rights violations provided crucial guidance for building charges that would not only hold Flemming accountable, but create precedent for future cases. "We're filing charges under Section 242 of Title 18, which criminalizes the willful deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law," Amanda explained. Agent Mercer's case provides clear evidence of racial bias and excessive force, but the pattern evidence shows this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of Flemming's standard operating procedure. Linda Hayes continued her investigation at the police department, now armed with federal support and legal protection for officers willing to break their silence. Detective James Rodriguez knocked on her door, wearing a green polo shirt under his jacket, ready to provide testimony about Flemming's history. "Todd used to brag about his arrest statistics in black neighborhoods," Rodriguez admitted, his conscience finally overcoming years of institutional pressure. "He called it cleaning up the streets, but we all knew he was targeting people based on race rather than actual suspicious behavior." The testimonies painted a picture of an officer whose prejudices had been an open secret within the department, tolerated and sometimes encouraged by supervisors who valued arrest numbers over constitutional rights. The blue wall of silence had protected Flemming for years, but Calvin Mercer's federal credentials had finally broken that protection. By afternoon, Linda Hayes had compiled overwhelming evidence of Flemming's pattern of racial discrimination. The body cam footage alone provided dozens of examples of unconstitutional stops and searches, while officer testimony revealed the institutional culture that had enabled such behavior. Calvin Mercer returned to the federal building, knowing his personal humiliation had uncovered a web of systemic discrimination that demanded federal intervention. His FBI colleagues had rallied around him not just as a friend, but as a symbol of the discrimination they had all faced in various forms throughout their careers. The investigation had revealed how one officer's racism reflected broader problems within law enforcement culture, where racial profiling had been normalized and complaints from black citizens routinely dismissed. But it had also shown how federal oversight and community pressure could break through institutional protection to demand accountability. Linda Hayes prepared her preliminary report, knowing it would trigger the most comprehensive investigation in her department's history. Officer Todd Flemming's pattern of prejudice was about to face the full weight of federal justice, while the institutional failures that had protected him for years would finally be exposed to public scrutiny. The pattern was clear, the evidence overwhelming, and justice was finally within reach. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the federal courthouse as federal prosecutor Amanda Foster adjusted her crisp red blazer and stepped up to the podium. Behind her, the seal of the United States Department of Justice gleamed against the marble wall, while dozens of reporters filled the press room. Camera flashes illuminated her determined expression as she opened the folder containing what would become one of the most significant civil rights cases in the city's recent history. Good morning. I am Federal Prosecutor Amanda Foster, and I am here to announce that the United States Department of Justice is filing federal civil rights charges against Officer Todd Flemming of the Metropolitan Police Department. Her voice carried the weight of federal authority as she continued. These charges stem from Officer Flemming's egregious violation of FBI Special Agent Calvin Mercer's constitutional rights during an incident that occurred outside the federal building on 5th Street. The room erupted with questions, but Amanda Foster raised her hand for silence. Her red suit commanded attention as she detailed the charges. Officer Flemming is being charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal felony that carries significant penalties including imprisonment. Additionally, we are launching a comprehensive investigation into the Metropolitan Police Department's practices and policies regarding racial profiling and use of force. 3 floors above the press conference, Calvin Mercer sat across from FBI investigators in a sterile interview room filled with natural light from the overhead skylights. He had changed from his undercover green hoodie into a professional navy suit and white shirt, his federal badge prominently displayed on his belt. The transformation from the man kneeling on the sidewalk just days earlier was striking, yet the memory of that humiliation burned clearly in his mind. Agent Mercer, please describe the federal investigation you were conducting when Officer Flemming approached you, asked Senior Investigator Patricia Wells, her pen poised over a legal pad. The fluorescent lights cast sharp shadows across the conference table covered with case files and body cam footage screenshots. Calvin Mercer leaned forward, his voice steady and professional. I was conducting surveillance on suspected money laundering operations involving 3 businesses on 5th Street. This was part of Operation Clean Sweep, a 6-month federal investigation into organized financial crimes. I had positioned myself outside the federal building because it provided optimal sight lines to all 3 target locations. He paused, referring to his notes. At approximately 12:47 p.m., I observed suspicious activity at the first target location. I was preparing to photograph license plates when Officer Flemming approached from behind and immediately drew his weapon without identifying himself or stating any lawful reason for the stop. The federal investigator nodded, making detailed notes. What was the impact of Officer Flemming's actions on your ongoing federal investigation? Calvin Mercer's jaw tightened slightly. Catastrophic. My cover was completely blown. 6 months of careful positioning and relationship building with informants was destroyed in minutes. 3 suspects we had under surveillance immediately fled the area when they saw the police response. We lost crucial evidence and had to completely restructure our approach. He gestured to a thick file on the table. The financial crimes we were investigating involve over $2 million in laundered money and connections to a larger organized crime network. Officer Flemming's reckless actions compromised not just my safety, but a major federal operation with national implications. Meanwhile, across town at police headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Police Chief Robert Sullivan, a distinguished elderly man in his characteristic blue jacket, paced behind his desk as afternoon sunlight filtered through the windows. His white hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and his usually pristine uniform showed signs of the stress he had been under since the incident. "How bad is this, Captain Morrison?" Chief Sullivan asked, his voice heavy with the weight of decades in law enforcement. Behind him, framed commendations and photos with city officials seemed to mock the current crisis engulfing his department. Captain James Morrison sat rigidly in the chair opposite the chief's desk, his own uniform impeccable despite the chaos surrounding them. "Sir, it's worse than we initially thought. The federal investigation isn't just about Flemming anymore. They're examining our entire department's practices going back 5 years." Chief Sullivan stopped pacing and fixed his subordinate with a steely gaze. "What exactly are they looking for?" "Everything, sir. Training records, complaint files, use of force reports, body cam footage, demographic data on traffic stops and arrests. They want to know if Flemming's behavior was an isolated incident or part of a pattern we should have identified and addressed." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I have to ask, did you know about the previous complaints against Flemming?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Chief Sullivan slowly returned to his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "There were complaints, yes, but nothing that rose to the level of federal intervention. We handled them through internal channels." "With respect, sir, federal investigators don't see it that way. They're treating each dismissed complaint as potential evidence of a cover-up or systematic indifference to civil rights violations." 2 floors below, in a cramped office that had become the nerve center of the federal investigation, teams of investigators worked methodically through mountains of evidence. Special Agent in Charge Rebecca Torres, wearing a professional green blouse and dark pants, coordinated the massive undertaking while multiple television screens displayed different angles of the Flemming incident on continuous loop. "What do we have on the body cam analysis?" she asked technical specialist David Park, who was hunched over a computer workstation surrounded by multiple monitors. "It's damning," Park replied without looking up from his screen. "We've isolated 43 distinct statements from Flemming during the 11-minute encounter. 28 of those statements contain explicit racial assumptions or stereotypes. The audio enhancement clearly captures him saying 'another drug dealer punk' before he even approached Agent Mercer. Agent Torres studied the frozen image on the main screen, showing Calvin Mercer on his knees with his hands raised while Flemming stood over him with his weapon drawn. What about the crowd reaction analysis? 17 different civilians recorded portions of the incident on their phones. The consistency is remarkable. Every single recording captures Flemming making assumptions about Agent Mercer's criminal activity based purely on his appearance and clothing. There's no audio evidence of any actual suspicious behavior." Park clicked through several video files, each showing the same scene from different angles. The most damaging footage comes from a tourist from Denmark who was recording the federal building for a travel blog. She captured the entire incident from start to finish, including clear audio of everything Flemming said. Back at the courthouse, Amanda Foster continued her methodical dismantling of any potential defense for Officer Flemming. She had moved to a private conference room where she met with Calvin Mercer and his attorney to prepare for the formal grand jury presentation. "Agent Mercer, I want you to understand the broader significance of this case," Amanda Foster said. her red suit a stark contrast against the neutral conference room walls. This isn't just about one bad officer. This is about sending a clear message that federal agents, and indeed all citizens, have constitutional rights that cannot be violated by local law enforcement. Calvin Mercer nodded, his composed demeanor unchanged despite the gravity of the situation. I understand, ma'am. I also want to ensure that other officers who might be inclined towards similar behavior understand there will be consequences. Amanda Foster opened a thick folder filled with legal documents. The grand jury will hear testimony about the immediate incident, but also about the broader pattern of behavior that allowed this situation to develop. We have evidence of at least 12 previous complaints against Officer Flemming involving similar racial profiling incidents. She pulled out several photographs and documents. Each of these complaints was either dismissed outright or resulted in minimal discipline. We believe this demonstrates a pattern of institutional indifference that enabled Flemming's escalating behavior. Calvin Mercer studied the documents with professional interest. What kind of timeline are we looking at for prosecution? Given the strength of the evidence and the federal nature of the charges, I expect we'll have an indictment within 30 days. The broader departmental investigation will take considerably longer, but we're committed to a thorough examination of systemic issues. Meanwhile, in a downtown office building, Officer Todd Flemming sat across from his union-appointed attorney in what felt like an increasingly futile attempt to mount a defense. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the conference table covered with police reports, witness statements, and legal briefs. Attorney Michael Rodriguez, a seasoned defense lawyer in a wrinkled gray suit, shook his head as he reviewed the body cam footage for what felt like the 100th time. Todd, I have to be straight with you. This is not looking good. The federal prosecutors have an airtight case, and your own words on the body cam footage are going to be nearly impossible to explain away. Flemming, still in his off-duty clothes of jeans and a faded polo shirt, looked haggard and desperate. The confident swagger he had displayed during the incident had been replaced by a hollow-eyed anxiety. But I was doing my job, Mike. I saw what I thought was suspicious activity, and I responded according to my training. Rodriguez paused the video at the moment when Calvin Mercer first raised his hands. Todd, listen to yourself on this recording. You immediately assumed he was a drug dealer. You made verbal statements about his appearance and his clothing that clearly indicate racial bias. No reasonable jury is going to see this as legitimate police work. The attorney fast-forwarded to the moment when Calvin Mercer revealed his federal badge. And this moment right here, when you realized he was an FBI agent, your entire demeanor changed instantly. If you truly believed he was engaged in criminal activity, his badge shouldn't have mattered. The fact that you immediately backed down proves you knew your initial assumptions were wrong. Flemming buried his head in his hands. What are my options here? Honestly, very limited. The federal prosecutors are talking about making an example of this case. They want to send a message about racial profiling and police misconduct. Your best bet might be to consider a plea agreement that includes cooperation with the broader department investigation. Back at FBI headquarters, Calvin Mercer was meeting with his supervisor Rachel Kim in her office overlooking the city. Afternoon light streamed through the windows, illuminating the commendations and case photos that decorated the walls. Calvin, I want you to know that the entire bureau stands behind you, Rachel Kim said, her professional demeanor softened by genuine concern. She wore a red blazer over a white blouse, her appearance always impeccably professional. This incident reflects broader issues that law enforcement agencies across the country need to address. Calvin Mercer sat forward in his chair, his navy suit and white shirt giving him an air of quiet authority. Thank you, ma'am. I have to admit, the whole experience was more jarring than I expected. I've faced discrimination before, but never while conducting federal business. Rachel Kim nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly why this case is so important. If a federal agent can be subjected to this kind of treatment, Imagine what ordinary citizens face every day. The Justice Department sees this as an opportunity to address systemic problems. She gestured to a stack of files on her desk. We've been asked to provide expert testimony about the impact of Flemming's actions on federal law enforcement operations. I want you to lead that effort. Of course, ma'am. The operational impact was significant, but I think the symbolic impact might be even more important. Rachel Kim smiled slightly. Exactly. You handled an impossible situation with remarkable professionalism. That composure under pressure is exactly what we want other agents to emulate, and what we want the public to see from federal law enforcement. As the day progressed, the federal investigation machine continued its methodical work. In laboratories, technicians enhanced audio recordings to capture every word of Flemming's tirade. In conference rooms, attorneys built the legal framework for charges that could result in years of federal prison time. In police headquarters, officers who had remained silent about Flemming's behavior for years began to reconsider their position as federal investigators asked pointed questions about departmental culture. The transformation was already beginning. What started as one officer's racist assumptions had evolved into a comprehensive examination of institutional practices and individual accountability. Calvin Mercer's moment of humiliation was becoming a catalyst for the kind of systematic change that civil rights advocates had been demanding for decades. As evening approached and the federal building began to empty, Amanda Foster reviewed her case files one final time. The red suit she had worn to the press conference hung neatly on the back of her office door, replaced by a comfortable green sweater as she worked late into the night. The evidence against Flemming was overwhelming, but more importantly, the broader investigation was uncovering patterns of behavior that demanded federal intervention. Tomorrow would bring new witnesses, additional evidence, and continued pressure on a police department struggling to reconcile its past practices with federal oversight. But tonight, the wheels of federal justice turned steadily forward, powered by one FBI agent's refusal to accept injustice and a prosecutor's determination to ensure that constitutional rights meant something more than words on paper. The investigation was just beginning, but the message was already clear. Accountability was coming, and it carried the full weight of federal authority behind it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of Mount Olive Baptist Church as dozens of community members gathered, their voices rising in unified chants that echoed through the neighborhood streets. Signs reading "Justice for Agent Mercer" and "End Racial Profiling Now" swayed above the crowd, while local news crews positioned their cameras to capture the growing demonstration. The peaceful assembly had begun at dawn, organized through social media and community networks that had mobilized overnight in response to the federal building incident. Calvin Mercer stood at the edge of the crowd, watching with quiet amazement as his neighbors and fellow community members took to the streets on his behalf. He wore a simple green polo shirt and dark jeans, his FBI badge nowhere in sight, as he chose to blend in as just another concerned citizen. The weight of their support pressed against his chest, a mixture of gratitude and responsibility that made him understand how his personal encounter with Officer Todd Flemming had become something much larger than one man's fight for dignity. Reverend Michael Washington, a tall man in his 60s wearing an orange shirt beneath his blue ministerial jacket, raised his hands to quiet the crowd. His voice boomed across the assembly without need for amplification. Brothers and sisters, we gather here today not in anger, but in determination. What happened to Special Agent Calvin Mercer could have happened to any of us. What makes this different is that this time, the truth couldn't be buried, and justice cannot be denied. The crowd responded with supportive murmurs and raised fists, their energy building as more community members arrived. Calvin Mercer noticed familiar faces from his neighborhood, people he'd known for years who had never spoken about their own encounters with problematic policing. Today their silence was breaking, and their stories were demanding to be heard. Mrs. Dorothy Jenkins, An elderly woman in a blue jacket with silver hair gleaming in the sunlight stepped forward to address the gathering. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed decades of struggle and progress. "I've lived in this community for 47 years, and I've seen our young men treated like criminals for walking to the store, for driving nice cars, for existing while black. Agent Mercer's badge saved him. But what about our sons who don't have badges? What about our daughters who face the same prejudice?" Calvin Mercer felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to see Detective Maria Santos approaching. She wore civilian clothes, a red blouse, and dark slacks, her police badge conspicuously absent. The fact that she had come to the demonstration, off-duty and out of uniform, spoke volumes about her commitment to doing what was right, regardless of department politics. "Agent Mercer," Detective Santos said quietly, her voice barely audible over the crowd's growing energy. "I want you to know that what I'm about to do isn't easy, but it's necessary. I've been part of a system that allowed Flemming's behavior to continue, and I can't stay silent anymore." Before Calvin Mercer could respond, Detective Santos walked toward the makeshift platform where Reverend Washington was speaking. The crowd fell silent as she requested the microphone, her presence as a police officer creating a moment of electric tension that rippled through the assembly. "My name is Detective Maria Santos," she began, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the moment. "I was Officer Flemming's backup the day he held Agent Mercer at gunpoint. I want you to know that what happened that day was wrong, and it wasn't the first time I've witnessed behavior like this. I should have spoken up sooner. I should have reported what I saw. My silence made me complicit in a system that fails people like Agent Mercer every day." The crowd's response was immediate and powerful. Some applauded her courage, while others called out questions about other incidents and other officers. Detective Santos raised her hand, asking for quiet so she could continue. "I'm here today to publicly support the federal investigation into Officer Flemming's conduct. I'm also here to encourage other officers who have witnessed misconduct to find the courage to speak the truth. We cannot hide behind the badge anymore. We cannot protect officers who bring shame to the uniform and terror to the communities we're supposed to serve." Calvin Mercer watched as Detective Santos handed the microphone back to Reverend Washington, her face showing both relief and apprehension. Breaking the blue wall of silence was career suicide in many departments, but she had chosen truth over self-preservation. He made his way through the crowd to reach her, extending his hand in a gesture of respect and solidarity. "Detective Santos, what you just did took tremendous courage," Calvin Mercer said as they shook hands. "You could have stayed quiet, could have let the investigation proceed without your public support. Why risk your career?" Detective Santos looked out at the crowd, her eyes focusing on the children who had come with their parents to witness this moment of community action. "Because those kids deserve better. Because, Agent Mercer, you deserved better. Because every person in this community deserves to interact with police officers who see their humanity, not their skin color." Reverend Washington called Calvin Mercer to the platform, and the crowd erupted in applause as he made his way forward. He had not planned to speak, preferring to let the community lead their own response, but he understood that his voice was needed to give context and direction to their righteous anger. Standing before the microphone, Calvin Mercer surveyed the faces looking up at him with hope and expectation. He saw teenagers who reminded him of his younger self, parents who worried about their children's safety, elderly community members who had fought these battles for decades. His personal incident had become their collective moment of demand for change. 3 days ago, I was doing my job as an FBI agent when Officer Todd Flemming decided that my green hoodie and my black skin made me a threat. Calvin Mercer began, his voice carrying across the crowd without strain. He held me at gunpoint, called me a drug dealer, and told everyone within earshot that people who look like me don't belong near federal buildings. He was wrong about me, But more importantly, he would have been wrong about any of you. The crowd responded with agreement and encouragement, their energy feeding Calvin Mercer's determination to speak truth to power. He continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. This incident isn't just about one racist cop. It's about a system that allowed Officer Flemming to continue his pattern of racial profiling despite numerous complaints. It's about the thin blue line that protects bad officers while good officers like Detective Santos are pressured to stay silent. It's about the assumption that black men are guilty until proven innocent, dangerous until proven otherwise. Calvin Mercer paused, letting his words settle over the crowd before continuing with the central message he wanted to convey. But here's what Officer Flemming and others like him don't understand. We belong everywhere. In federal buildings, in nice neighborhoods, in positions of authority. I don't just carry a badge. I represent every black man who has been profiled, every black woman who has been dismissed, every black child who has been seen as a threat instead of a treasure. The demonstration continued for 2 more hours, with community members sharing their own stories of encounters with Officer Flemming and other problematic officers. Calvin Mercer listened to account after account of racial profiling, excessive force, and institutional indifference that painted a picture of systemic problems extending far beyond one incident. Reporter Jennifer Walsh moved through the crowd with her camera crew, conducting interviews that would become part of her ongoing coverage of the case. She approached Calvin Mercer as the formal demonstration began to wind down, her red blazer and professional demeanor marking her as media, even in the casual setting. Agent Mercer, this community response has been remarkable, Jennifer Walsh said as her cameraman adjusted his position to capture both of them in frame. How does it feel to see this level of support? And what do you hope comes from this mobilization? Calvin Mercer considered his response carefully, understanding that his words would reach far beyond the immediate crowd. It's humbling and inspiring to see the community come together like this. What I hope is that this energy translates into sustained pressure for real reform. One incident caught on camera isn't enough. We need systemic change that addresses the root causes of racial profiling and holds officers accountable for their actions. As the crowd began to disperse, Calvin Mercer found himself surrounded by community members who wanted to shake his hand, share their stories, or simply express their gratitude for his composure during the incident. Each interaction reminded him of the weight of representation he carried, not just as an FBI agent, but as a symbol of resistance against injustice. Mrs. Jenkins approached him as the crowd thinned, her elderly frame moving with determined purpose. "Son, you handled yourself with such dignity when that officer tried to humiliate you. But I want you to know that standing up comes with a cost. Are you prepared for what they're going to try to do to your reputation, your career, your family?" Calvin Mercer nodded, appreciating her wisdom born from decades of struggle. "Mrs. Jenkins, I've been preparing for this my whole life. Every black man in America knows that eventually we'll face a moment where we have to choose between our safety and our dignity. I was fortunate that my federal badge protected me, but I can't let that protection shield me from fighting for others who don't have badges." As the sun reached its afternoon peak, casting bright natural light over the dispersing crowd, Calvin Mercer reflected on how quickly his life had changed. 3 days ago, he was an undercover federal agent conducting routine surveillance. Today, he was the face of a movement demanding police accountability and racial justice. Detective Santos approached him one final time before leaving, her expression showing both determination and concern. "Agent Mercer, I want you to know that there are other officers who feel the way I do. We're going to speak up, but it's going to get ugly before it gets better. The department doesn't like officers who break ranks, even when we're doing the right thing." Calvin Mercer shook her hand again, understanding the sacrifice she was making. "Detective Santos, courage is contagious. Your willingness to speak truth will give other good officers permission to do the same. That's how systems change. One person at a time, choosing to do what's right instead of what's easy. As the community demonstration officially ended, Calvin Mercer realized that his journey was just beginning. The incident with Officer Todd Flemming had opened a door that could never be closed, revealing the depth of community pain and the hunger for justice that existed just beneath the surface of everyday life. Walking back toward his car, Calvin Mercer felt the weight of expectation and hope that the community had placed on his shoulders. He understood that his personal victory would only be meaningful if it translated into broader change for others who might not be as fortunate when they faced their moment of testing. The afternoon sun continued to shine overhead, its bright light illuminating a community that had found its voice, and a federal agent who had discovered his true purpose extended far beyond any single investigation. The real work of transformation was just beginning, and Calvin Mercer was ready to lead by example, knowing that justice delayed was justice denied, but justice achieved could light the way for generations to come. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Police Chief Robert Sullivan's office as Internal Affairs Investigator Linda Hayes placed a thick manila folder on his mahogany desk. Her orange blouse caught the natural light as she straightened her blue jacket, her expression grave but determined. Chief Sullivan, his weathered face reflecting years of difficult decisions, opened the folder with trembling hands that betrayed his 72 years beneath his crisp blue jacket. Chief Sullivan, what you're about to see represents the most comprehensive pattern of racial misconduct I've documented in 23 years of internal investigations, Linda Hayes announced, her voice cutting through the morning silence like a blade of justice. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across the evidence spread before them: body cam screenshots, witness statements, and federal documentation that painted a damning portrait of Officer Todd Flemming's career. 3 floors below in the precinct's cramped break room, Officer Todd Flemming sat hunched over a styrofoam cup of cold coffee, his short-sleeved uniform wrinkled from a sleepless night. Dark circles shadowed his eyes as he scrolled through social media on his phone, watching his professional reputation crumble in real time. Comments flooded every news article about his confrontation with FBI agent Calvin Mercer, each word of public condemnation driving deeper into his psyche like nails in a coffin. Back in the chief's office, Linda Hayes methodically presented her findings. Body cam footage from the federal building incident shows Officer Flemming made 17 racially charged statements in 12 minutes, she explained, pointing to time-stamped transcripts. But this pattern extends far beyond one incident. I've identified 43 civilian complaints against Flemming over the past 5 years, 38 involving racial profiling allegations that were dismissed or minimized by supervisors. Chief Sullivan's hands shook as he reviewed photograph after photograph of black men and women who had filed complaints against Flemming. Each face told a story of humiliation, fear, and injustice that the system had failed to address. The weight of institutional complicity pressed down on his shoulders like a mountain of moral failure. At the federal building across town, Calvin Mercer sat in a conference room with federal prosecutor Amanda Foster, who wore a sharp red blazer that commanded authority in the bright morning light. Her laptop displayed a comprehensive timeline of Flemming's misconduct, supported by federal evidence that would form the backbone of their civil rights case. Agent Mercer, your composure during that incident preserved crucial evidence that exposes systemic problems beyond one officer's racism, Amanda Foster explained, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she pulled up additional case files. Federal surveillance footage from building security cameras captured angles the body cams missed, showing Flemming's aggression escalated even after you identified yourself as federal law enforcement. Calvin Mercer nodded thoughtfully, his green hoodie replaced today by a professional Navy suit that reflected his federal authority. Prosecutor Foster, this isn't just about what happened to me. It's about every black person who encountered Flemming without a badge to protect them. Every complaint that got buried, every pattern of behavior that the system chose to ignore. The fluorescent conference room lights illuminated federal documents, spread across the table like pieces of a complex puzzle. Each piece of evidence represented not just legal proof, but human dignity restored through methodical justice. Calvin Mercer's testimony would anchor the prosecution's case, but the real power lay in the undeniable pattern of misconduct that federal investigators had uncovered. Meanwhile, Detective Maria Santos knocked on Chief Sullivan's door, her green uniform shirt crisp under the overhead lighting. She had requested this meeting to provide additional testimony that would further seal Flemming's fate. Her decision to break the traditional blue wall of silence represented a seismic shift in police culture that rippled through the department like an earthquake of accountability. "Chief, I need to report incidents I witnessed but failed to document," Maria Santos announced, her voice steady despite the personal cost of her revelation. "Officer Flemming made racially inappropriate comments during at least 6 traffic stops I observed over the past 2 years. I remained silent because I feared retaliation, but Agent Mercer's courage has shown me that silence enables injustice." Linda Hayes leaned forward, her pen poised over a fresh incident report form. The natural skylight streaming through the chief's windows seemed to illuminate this moment of truth-telling, casting Detective Santos in an almost ethereal glow of moral courage. Each detail she provided added another layer to the overwhelming case against Flemming. Down in the parking garage, Officer Todd Flemming sat in his patrol car, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The fluorescent garage lighting made his face appear gaunt and hollow, a physical manifestation of his crumbling career. His radio crackled with routine calls, but he knew his days of responding to anything were numbered. The federal investigation had made him radioactive within the department, a liability that no supervisor wanted to risk deploying. His phone buzzed with a text message from his union representative. "Emergency meeting in 1 hour. Bring all documentation related to the federal building incident. Prospects for defense are extremely limited." The words blurred together as Flemming realized that decades of racist behavior were finally catching up with him in ways he never imagined possible. Back in Chief Sullivan's office, the evidence presentation reached its climax as Linda Hayes displayed the most damning piece of documentation. "Chief, this federal analysis of Flemming's arrest patterns shows he was 14 times more likely to stop black drivers than white drivers on identical routes, and 37 times more likely to conduct vehicle searches without warrant-supported probable cause." The statistical analysis glowed on Linda Hayes' laptop screen, numbers that transformed individual complaints into undeniable proof of systematic racial bias. Chief Sullivan's blue jacket seemed to weigh heavier on his shoulders as he confronted the mathematical reality of discrimination that had flourished under his leadership. Federal prosecutor Amanda Foster's phone rang with an update from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Additional witnesses had come forward after seeing news coverage of Calvin Mercer's incident, each person providing testimony that strengthened the federal case against Flemming. The prosecutor's red blazer seemed to glow with satisfaction as she relayed this information to Calvin Mercer. "Agent Mercer, we now have 17 additional witnesses willing to testify about similar encounters with Officer Flemming," Amanda Foster announced, her voice carrying the weight of impending justice. "Your incident was the catalyst that gave other victims the courage to speak truth to power. This case will send a message that federal law enforcement takes civil rights violations seriously." The conference room's bright lighting seemed to amplify the significance of this moment. Calvin Mercer understood that his professional training and personal restraint during those terrifying minutes outside the federal building had preserved evidence that would now protect countless other people from experiencing similar treatment. At precisely 11:30 a.m., Chief Sullivan made the decision that would end Todd Flemming's law enforcement career. His signature on the termination paperwork felt like signing a death certificate for everything Flemming represented within the department. Linda Hayes witnessed the signature, her orange blouse and blue jacket creating a striking contrast against the formal documents that sealed Flemming's fate. Effective immediately, Officer Todd Flemming is terminated from the Metropolitan Police Department for conduct unbecoming an officer, violation of civil rights, and bringing dishonor to the badge, Chief Sullivan announced to Linda Hayes and Detective Santos. The words echoed through his office like a judicial pronouncement, final and irreversible. The notification process began immediately. Administrative personnel updated Flemming's status in the department database, while his access badges were electronically deactivated. His locker would be cleared, his uniform returned, and his service weapon surrendered. 22 years of law enforcement service would end in disgrace and federal prosecution. Officer Todd Flemming received the termination call while sitting in his patrol car, the fluorescent garage lighting casting harsh shadows across his face as his world collapsed through a brief phone conversation. Report to Chief Sullivan's office immediately to surrender all department property. The administrative voice informed him with bureaucratic efficiency that made his termination feel both sudden and inevitable. As Flemming walked through the police station for the final time, fellow officers averted their eyes or whispered among themselves. The institutional culture that had once protected him through silence now abandoned him completely. His short-sleeved uniform, which had once represented authority and power, now felt like a costume from a play that had ended badly. In Chief Sullivan's office, the termination process proceeded with methodical precision under the bright overhead lighting. Flemming's badge and service weapon were surrendered while Linda Hayes documented each item for evidence preservation. The federal investigation would require access to his equipment for forensic analysis that might reveal additional misconduct. Officer Flemming, you are hereby notified that federal civil rights charges are pending against you, Chief Sullivan announced, his blue jacket creating a stark contrast against Flemming's now powerless uniform. You are prohibited from contacting any witnesses or attempting to influence ongoing investigations. Any violation of these restrictions will result in additional federal charges. The words hit Flemming like physical blows, each legal restriction tightening around him like chains of consequence for decades of racist behavior. His attempts to maintain dignity crumbled as the reality of federal prosecution settled over him like a suffocating blanket of justice finally delivered. Detective Maria Santos received official commendation for her cooperation with the federal investigation, recognition that highlighted how accountability could coexist with law enforcement loyalty. Her willingness to testify truthfully about Flemming's pattern of misconduct had protected the department's integrity while ensuring justice for Calvin Mercer and countless other victims. The ripple effects of Flemming's termination spread through the department like waves of transformation. Officers who had witnessed misconduct but remained silent began scheduling meetings with internal affairs, their consciences awakened by the consequences finally imposed on racist behavior. The culture of protection through silence was cracking under the pressure of federal scrutiny and moral awakening. As news of Flemming's termination reached the media, reporter Jennifer Walsh prepared her evening broadcast with updates on the federal case progression. The bright newsroom lighting illuminated her red blouse as she reviewed interview footage with community members who expressed satisfaction that justice was finally being served. Calvin Mercer learned of Flemming's termination through a call from federal prosecutor Amanda Foster, who confirmed that the criminal case would proceed regardless of employment status. The federal charges carried potential prison time that would ensure Flemming faced consequences far beyond losing his job. The afternoon sun streamed through the federal building windows as Calvin Mercer returned to his desk, his regular FBI duties resuming despite his new role as a symbol of justice against police misconduct. His green hoodie hung in his locker, a reminder of how quickly circumstances could change when racism encountered federal authority backed by unshakable composure and institutional support. Todd Flemming's fall from grace was complete, his racist assumptions finally meeting consequences that would echo through his life and serve as warning to others who might mistake a badge for license to discriminate. Justice had delivered its verdict through systematic accountability that transformed one man's humiliation into institutional change and hope for cultural transformation. 6 months had passed since that bright afternoon when Calvin Mercer knelt on the sun-drenched sidewalk outside the federal building, and today's federal courthouse scene carried the weight of justice finally delivered. The overhead fluorescent lights illuminated the packed courtroom as Judge Patricia Williams, wearing her judicial robes with quiet authority, prepared to sentence former Officer Todd Flemming. The natural skylight streaming through the tall windows created an almost ceremonial atmosphere as the moment of final accountability arrived. Calvin Mercer sat in the gallery wearing a crisp green dress shirt and dark slacks, his posture reflecting the same composed dignity he had maintained throughout this entire ordeal. Federal Prosecutor Amanda Foster stood at the podium in her signature red blazer and blue skirt, addressing the court with the measured tone of someone who understood the historical significance of this moment. Her words carried beyond this single courtroom, reaching into every police department across the nation watching this precedent-setting case. "Your Honor, this case represents more than one officer's misconduct," Amanda Foster declared, her voice clear and unwavering. "It demonstrates how federal oversight can protect civil rights when local institutions fail to act." The defendant's actions that day weren't just against Agent Mercer personally, but against every citizen's right to equal treatment under law. Todd Flemming sat at the defendant's table in an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, his shoulders slumped in defeat as his attorney struggled to present mitigation arguments. The confident swagger he had displayed while pointing his weapon at Calvin Mercer had completely vanished, replaced by the hollow expression of a man whose worldview had been systematically dismantled by the very justice system he once believed protected his prejudices. Judge Williams reviewed the extensive case file one final time before speaking. "Mr. Flemming, your actions on that April afternoon violated your oath as a police officer and the civil rights of a federal agent conducting his lawful duties. The evidence shows a pattern of racial profiling that went unchecked for years, enabled by institutional indifference that this court cannot ignore." Calvin Mercer watched as justice took its measured course, remembering how Detective Maria Santos had tried to warn Flemming that day, how FBI Supervisor Rachel Kim had arrived to find her agent held at gunpoint by the very people sworn to protect and serve. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that Flemming's attempt to humiliate Calvin Mercer had instead exposed a system of discrimination that federal prosecutors were now dismantling piece by piece. "The court sentences you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation," Judge Williams announced. "You are permanently barred from law enforcement and will complete community service, specifically focused on civil rights education." The gavel's sound echoed through the courtroom like a final punctuation mark on months of investigation, testimony, and institutional soul-searching that had transformed not just individual careers, but entire departmental cultures. Calvin Mercer felt no satisfaction in Flemming's downfall, only relief that the system had finally worked as intended, protecting the vulnerable rather than enabling the powerful. Outside the courthouse, reporter Jennifer Walsh approached Calvin Mercer with her camera crew, seeking the statement that would close this chapter of her coverage. She wore a professional red dress suit that commanded respect in the bright afternoon sunlight, her questions reflecting the deeper implications of this case for police reform nationwide. "Agent Mercer, how does it feel to see this case reach its conclusion?" she asked, holding her microphone steady as pedestrians paused to witness this moment of accountability. Calvin Mercer adjusted his green shirt collar and looked directly into the camera, his words measured and thoughtful. "Justice isn't about revenge or personal satisfaction. It's about ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to others who might not have a federal badge to protect them. This case proved that accountability is possible when institutions choose courage over comfort. The interview continued as Calvin Mercer explained how the incident had changed not just his own perspective, but the entire approach to police-community relations in their city. Detective Maria Santos had been promoted to head the new Community Relations Unit. Her courage in speaking truth about her former partner, earning her both criticism from some colleagues and praise from community leaders who recognized authentic allyship when they witnessed it. 3 weeks later, Calvin Mercer found himself in a different kind of spotlight, standing before the National Police Reform Conference in Washington, D.C. The hotel ballroom buzzed with conversations between police chiefs, civil rights attorneys, federal prosecutors, and community activists who had gathered to learn from his experience. The overhead lighting illuminated an audience hungry for solutions to problems that had persisted for generations. FBI Supervisor Rachel Kim introduced Calvin Mercer to the assembly, her red blazer and blue skirt reflecting the federal authority behind the reform initiatives spreading across the country. Agent Mercer's composure under extraordinary circumstances didn't just protect his own dignity, she announced. It created a teaching moment that's transforming law enforcement training from coast to coast. Calvin Mercer approached the podium wearing his green dress shirt and dark pants, carrying notes for a presentation that had evolved from personal experience into national policy recommendations. The audience included police officials who had traveled hundreds of miles to understand how one incident could catalyze such comprehensive change. 6 months ago, I was conducting routine federal surveillance when Officer Todd Flemming decided my green hoodie and dark skin made me a threat worth holding at gunpoint. Calvin Mercer began, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system. What happened next wasn't just about two individuals, but about systems that either enable prejudice or demand accountability. He walked the audience through the incident's timeline, explaining how body camera footage had become crucial evidence, how witness testimonies had corroborated the discriminatory nature of Flemming's actions, and how federal oversight had succeeded where local complaint procedures had repeatedly failed. Police chiefs in the audience took notes as Calvin Mercer detailed the investigative process that had uncovered Flemming's pattern of racial profiling. The real victory isn't Todd Flemming's prison sentence, Calvin Mercer explained, gesturing toward PowerPoint slides showing crime statistics and community trust metrics. It's the bias training programs now mandatory in our city, the civilian oversight board with real authority, and the cultural shift that makes officers like Detective Maria Santos feel safe speaking truth about misconduct. Internal Affairs investigator Linda Hayes, seated in the front row wearing her orange blouse and blue jacket, nodded approvingly as Calvin Mercer described the investigation that had transformed her department's approach to civilian complaints. Her methodical review of Flemming's history had become a model for identifying patterns of problematic behavior before they escalated to federal violations. The presentation continued as Calvin Mercer showed video testimony from community members who described improved police interactions since the reforms began. Federal prosecutor Amanda Foster had provided statistics showing how this case encouraged similar prosecutions nationwide, creating precedent that protected civil rights across jurisdictional boundaries. Change happens when individual courage meets institutional accountability, Calvin Mercer concluded, his words carrying the weight of lived experience. My federal badge protected me that day, but lasting reform protects everyone who comes after us. The standing ovation reflected more than appreciation for one man's presentation. It represented hope that systemic change was possible when communities demanded better and institutions chose growth over defensiveness. 2 months later, Calvin Mercer stood in a completely different environment, addressing 8th grade students at Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School. The classroom's fluorescent lighting illuminated eager young faces as he wore his green polo shirt and dark khakis, speaking to the next generation about justice, perseverance, and the power of maintaining dignity under pressure. Who can tell me what civil rights means? Calvin Mercer asked. watching hands shoot up across the classroom as students engaged with concepts that would shape their understanding of citizenship and equality. A young girl in the front row raised her hand enthusiastically. "It means everyone gets treated fairly by the police and the government, no matter what color their skin is." "That's exactly right," Calvin Mercer replied, smiling at the simplicity and profundity of her answer. "And when that doesn't happen, we have systems in place to make it right, but only when people are brave enough to use them." He told them about the incident in age-appropriate terms, explaining how staying calm and trusting in justice had ultimately led to positive changes that protected their entire community. The students listened intently as he described how one moment of crisis had created opportunities for learning and growth that extended far beyond individual circumstances. "The most important thing I can tell you is this," Calvin Mercer said, walking among the desks as students hung on his every word. "Your character is defined not by what happens to you, but by how you respond to what happens to you. When someone treats you unfairly because of who you are, you don't have to accept it, but you also don't have to become like them." As the school bell rang and students gathered their backpacks, Calvin Mercer reflected on how far this journey had traveled from that bright April afternoon when he knelt on concrete while Todd Flemming's Prejudice was broadcast to the world. The transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete, but progress was measurable in changed policies, shifted attitudes, and young people who understood their rights and responsibilities as citizens. Detective Maria Santos had called him the previous week to report that civilian complaints in her district had dropped significantly, not because problems were being ignored, but because officers were receiving better training and community members felt their concerns would be heard. Federal prosecutor Amanda Foster was using their case to train prosecutors nationwide, ensuring that civil rights violations would face consistent federal response regardless of local politics. Calvin Mercer's badge had always represented federal authority, but now it symbolized something more: the possibility that justice could prevail when courage met opportunity, when individual dignity sparked institutional change, and when communities refused to accept discrimination as inevitable. The legacy of that April afternoon would continue through reformed police departments, empowered communities, and young people who understood that their voices mattered in the ongoing work of creating a more perfect union. Todd Flemming's moment of prejudice had backfired spectacularly, becoming instead a catalyst for the very changes his worldview had sought to prevent. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.